Alright, today we're going to be putting together the Polaris Ranger motor. I'm going to walk through every detail of this motor. So this video may be lengthy. I won't do a lot of editing to this video. I will just show you exactly how it goes. So you can skip through this video if you need to. We're replacing the crank. This is a 700 motor. We're putting an 800. I'll show you the difference. But crankcases, camshaft, oil pump, all that is going to be the same. I'm going to go ahead and replace our lower bushings here to start. You want to make sure that all these surfaces are cleaned up and ready to go. Make sure they go back in there the exact same way that you took them apart. So those you kind of tap down in there, they'll fit down there about perfectly. And you don't want to use anything metal, but that you'll want them to be flush. And once you pinch your cases together, they'll actually kind of center themselves, but you want to get them awful close. We've got our other side here. There's going to be two of these larger ones, and there's not going to be a gasket putting these two together, so it's going to be a liquid gasket. So you want to make sure that make sure you've got a liquid gasket sealer handy. Then we've got four other of these bushings here, these two-piece bushings. So grab a pick or a small screwdriver. Remember how these go in, because they'll go back the same way. So we've got a lip over on this side, so you want to make sure going back together, you put the lip over on that side. We've got our camshaft in there, and that just slides in and out. That one's flush. We'll grab our last two here. Alright, we can just throw these in the trash. Make sure, going back together, that this clip right here will sit right down that groove, and then you'll have an oil seal sitting on this groove over on this side. So we'll drop this down in there, but first we're going to dab some oil. So I just have a cap of oil that I'm just going to be using quite often, just to kind of lube things up as we're going together. We don't want anything running dry even for the shortest amount of time. Make sure your rods are going through there. There we go. You can turn it over, make sure it feels smooth. Don't forget our seal here. This is a hot rod seal. The kit that I purchased to rebuild this motor didn't include this seal, so make sure that if you're building your motor, let me know if you need the parts. I can get you the part. I can get you the complete set. We will put our crank balancer in. Now the difference between the 7 and the 800s is this right here. These rods are going to be hitting our table there, but this on the 700s, 700 balancer here won't slide into the 800 cranks. So you've got to actually take a grinder and shave down both sides, but more emphasis on this side here. It'd be your clutch. Whoops, excuse me, I've got that turned backwards. It would be the opposite. No, it still would be your clutch side. So the stator side, you don't have to do as much grinding. A little bit, kind of get the edge off there, but the bulk of the grinding has to be done on this side. And I didn't take measurements before. I didn't think it was going to be that much, but it ended up being, I would say, probably 1/8 of an inch, but that's just kind of a guess. And then slide that in there. Then that will spin freely around. Obviously, if the crank isn't in the right position, it's not going to. And at this point, we will take and put this other case half on. It's going to take a little bit of time for me to goop this up here, so bear with me. If you've got oil on these cases, this sealant won't stick good. So make sure that oil is cleaned up at this point. If you dripped any when you were lubing up those areas that I was talking about, make sure those are all cleaned up. It doesn't really matter which side you goop up at this point. Okay, now we're going to start putting goop on here. You don't want to do so much that you will fill up bolt holes, then your bolt's going to have a hard time going in there. So just be a little careful when you're going around those areas. this goop here does a really good job of filling in the cracks. So all right, so we've got goop around there. Okay, I'm going to dab a little bit of oil, make sure that none of this is going to come off. We don't want this sealer in oil orifices. And these are where the two places that I dabbed here are the crank bearing here, holder here, and then the counterbalancer. So got those lubed up. Now we're going to set this case on here. Two different sizes on these. Okay, I should have been counting to let you know how many there was, but just make sure all the holes are filled. I like to snug up a couple of them before I start really torquing them down. Alright, now we can go around. You want to make sure all of them get done. So whatever your best way of doing that is. One thing I will want to tell you, make sure you know the limit of your impact so you're not tightening these down so far that they're breaking off. These are threaded, two different thread pitches, so make sure those are done right. You've got the finer thread actually goes up in this case. All right, we can clean up now any excess liquid gasket. Now we are ready for some gears. I'll clean this area up good as well. There's actually a gasket that goes on here. Now we've got a couple gears here that we're going to put together. First, you want to put this plate on here. Make sure this plate goes on before you try and put the gears on, or you'll never get that plate on. This plate is necessary. It's a holder for that camshaft. Make sure it doesn't slide too far out. And then it's also a holder for the crankshaft balancer. I like to, these bolts need a thread lock on there. And that is, if these bolts come out, all these gears are turned. If they even start coming out, don't need that much. It will cause some serious damage. So make sure you've got thread lock on there. T30 and they're tapered, so they'll kind of center that plate, but don't torque them all down until you get them all in there. Now these are very small bolts, so don't over torque these. If you got thread lock on there, they're not going to come out. So snug them up good. There's really only 2 bolts in here on this motor that really have to be torqued, and I'll show you those when we get there. Okay, now we've got your countershaft or your crankshaft balancer gear here. We've got a cotter or a keeper right there, woodruff key. So make sure that's installed. I like to tip those slightly down so that when our gear slides on there, it kind of pushes into it, and it'll actually level itself out, but you can't go too far that way. Now, it's crucial on these, you've got to have these marks lined up. So no mark on the oil pump, which isn't always the case, so make sure your model is the same way. Some of the oil pumps have to be lined up. So this is a tapered gear here, and there is a mark on the outside that will need to be matched up with the crank. But also then you've got the woodruff key there that needs to be matched up as well. So I kind of ballpark it. This dot's there, so the woodruff key is kind of facing a little bit down, And then again, these gears are tapered, so they're not going to be exactly, they're not going to look perfectly lined up until you get them slid into place. And then keep in mind the oil pump gear as well is tapered. And then we've actually got to turn this slightly down. Sometimes you can hook that woodruff key, kind of turn it. You can see, nice thing is you can look kind of right down and see if that woodruff key is lined up. Bad part is it's really hard to get a hand in there or anything to turn that crank balancer. You almost have to pull that gear off of there. There we go. Okay, we're lined up there. Everything's seated. Make sure you can see that woodruff key in there, and it's pushed everything down. And there's enough room with that crank balancer to allow that to go up and down like that. But when we put our bolt in there, it will line things up. Thread lock on there. Once you do one of these motors once, you'll understand they're fairly easy as far as motors are concerned. Without having that transmission in there to worry about, it just makes it a whole lot easier. Watch your finger. Okay, now we're going to be in the position. Right now we're going to have weight on that crank. I'm going to lift that crank up there, or this crank case up, spin this. You can look right down into your motor there. Okay. So next thing we're going to do, and your cam gear isn't on there yet, so there will be a little bit of added noise when you get that put on there. It also needs to be lined up. So I'm going to turn these, make sure, double check these are in the correct position. So those holes are, or those dots are lined up there. And this bolt is going to have thread lock on it as well. So what I do then, let's take a round punch, specific for this hole size. Push it in there as far as it can go. You've got a pin there that needs to line up with the camshaft. So first time you get it on there, you can kind of just play around with it and see where it's at. So it looks like this hole is slightly behind this one. And you want to line the camshaft up with the crank balancer. You get it into a spot there and it'll just kind of fall in place. And then just use that punch there to kind of push those gears into place, and then those dots should line up. Now you can take your already Loctite bolt, slide it on there. Make sure your washer is centered. It's kind of a spring washer. Okay, now we can pull this punch out of there. Those holes are kind of staying the same, obviously, since everything's lined up now. Take and turn that over again. Now you should see your camshaft moving around. Spin around a couple times. If you want to check your dots again, you can do that. Dots are lined up. Everything's thread locked over there. Okay, now we're gonna flip this back up. Next we got the stator cover, the inner cover, and then the water pump. Another common problem with these is the impellers seem to fail. They're plastic impellers. We purchased the aluminum. That is supposed to take care of a lot of the problems. Now we'll put this gasket on there. Oh, they're stuck on this case, so I guess it goes through right there. Just one maybe. Okay, make sure this seal is good. Like I said, this doesn't come with the kit that I ordered. Also, the other thing you want to make sure that there's no grooving on this. Make sure there's no wear on this shaft or you want to replace that. So I'm going to grab a little bit of an emery cloth and kind of clean that up, but it's not bad. You definitely don't want to use an aggressive emery cloth on this. If you do need to, then you want to replace it. But I'm just kind of a light groove, take any kind of rough edges off of there. Just kind of. There we go. Once that pin falls down into place, then you're all set there. I need to replace this this O-ring on the water pump here. And that O-ring is a good size. It should stay in there once you push it in there with your fingers there. Here, or excuse me, our water pump, we've got a seal. Looks like that. Your old one will have grooves in it. Your new one obviously won't, but you've got your lip that's actually down. So we've got a lip on both sides, but your lip actually sits down into there, and so your top side here actually has a groove. That's it there, and then this, let's see, goes on there. Yeah, I'm gonna Loctite them. Don't need much. 5mm Allen. Got our starter drive here. Got a washer in behind here, washer on the front. Make sure the bushing in behind that is good. It's a fairly common problem to have those going bad. Now for this water pump. Oh, there we go. It slid on there farther. Then you've got a washer, and then this is a lock nut here. No thread lock needed there. I like to take a rag, hold this. You hate to have this thing spin in your hands, but it really sucked that down. Now our flywheel here. Wipe any kind of debris out that was sitting on there. Check these gears. Your starter drive engages this, so a lot of times these gears wear, and you've got a Woodruff key in here. I'm going to put this impeller cover on now at this time. And we've got a handful of smaller bolts in there. I believe there's one longer one, maybe two. Alright, got the flywheel on. The flywheel nut is Loctited on there. We got our cover. We replaced the O-ring here, and we are going back together with this case. Make sure that O-ring stays in the position that it needs to be in. Going back together, and then you can just tap on that there. We've got a mess of bolts here, 10mm bolts. Goes around this cover. Alright, we got the flywheel on here with the nut on the outside. We've got Loctite on that nut. We put this cover on, and we've got our base gasket on here. We've got our lifters in there. We soaked those in oil, and now we're ready to go in with our pistons here. I've already put the clip on one side. I've started the pin on the other. Obviously, you got our base gasket down at this point. So I try to push these rods all the way up so that we have got as much room to work with these pistons going onto those cylinders as possible. You just got to find the spot that these go through. Now, a little trick to getting these in. I like to stick some rags down in here, being careful not to damage that gasket when you do that. Obviously, make sure they're clean rags. So slide these clips up in there. Then I take a pick and I'll find that groove that you use to pull the pin out, and then you just kind of use your fingers to push that circlip in there off the bottom of your pick. Now I'm going to slide that one forward. I'm going to do the same thing over here. So hold it with one hand. This will allow you to see a little bit better. Use your pick there, keep it pressed up there, and slide it in with this finger. There you go, make sure it's seated completely. Now your clips are all in and you're all set there. We've used oil, lubed up this cylinder really well, and now we're ready to put our pistons on there. One thing that you've probably heard time and time again, make sure that your rings are not, all the open ends aren't all at the same side. You want to try to offset those as much as possible. The nice thing is about these cylinders is the bottoms are tapered, so it kind of makes it a little bit easier to get these rings on there. The next thing, you want to make sure you're not digging into the gasket, and just kind of keep an eye in all areas so you're not pushing a ring out of its place there. If you are, stop, pull up just slightly. Don't pull up too far, otherwise you're going to redo everything again. And then you can kind of see here, make sure, look in the open skirts of the cylinder, or yeah, the cylinder barrels there, to make sure nothing's sticking, make sure nothing's poking down. And we've got one that looks like is holding us up here, this little oil ring here. So I'm gonna take a screwdriver and just kind of flatten that out. It's pulled up a little bit. So careful you don't pull it up all the way or you'll end up doing the whole thing again. I want to make sure that these are in the right position before going back together. So, yep, we just had an open end there, right at the skirt. So that's what's, there we go. Okay, now we're on. Slide it down into your block there. Again, kind of checking on the way to make sure everything's sealing properly. I'd take and wipe this excess off. Now we've got our head gasket here. Slide that on there. It goes one way is all it'll go if you have your dowel pins in there. It sits up, those dowel pins sit in there really low. So, one thing I wanted to show you before I put the cylinder on there, obviously I'm not going to pull it up now, but those pistons, since we're switching this to an 800, they're actually going to be smaller. So if you hold them side by side, I'm gonna say they're probably 3/8 of an inch shorter, maybe even close to a 1/2 inch shorter. So that's the difference between that allows that rod to come up higher out of that off that crank, and so those valves aren't hitting. We better put our push rods in there. I like to make sure these are clean. Obviously, I like to dab the top and the bottom. You can just stick it if you've got a little container of oil there. Stick your bottoms in there. So same thing with the tops, dab oil, dab oil, dab oil. Just to like to keep things lubricated. But these are one of the 2 screws on here that are torqued down, and they are torqued down to, book says somewhere in the 23 range. Actually, a lot of people break those off at 23, so I like to do 18 foot-pounds. It's plenty enough torque on there. Now we're going to slide our head on here. Make sure they all go in their separate grooves. So slide these on, make sure there's washers on the top there. These are all the same size. Bull nose rockers, that's all right. Easy enough to do. So 10 millimeter. These are torque down to like 21 foot-pounds, somewhere in that area. Start with the middle ones, then do the outside, and crisscross pattern. That way that gasket comes down evenly. And then you go ahead and torque those to 51, 53, somewhere in that range. So that's the order you do those in. And just kind of snug them up here. They're not even, I mean, these are pretty much finger tight at the point they are now. The motor will be running. Okay, I've got it set now at 20, let's do 23. Sometimes it can be a bit of a challenge to do that, especially when you get to this harder torque to hold this motor. where my second set of hands would come in handy. I think it's just, might be easier. I hate putting an extension on here. For this one, it's going to be okay. But for the 50 foot-pounds, one's done. Go over here to this crisscross. Make sure your intake boot is good. That's a fairly common problem, is for those intake boots to start leaking. This 700 doesn't have the sensor on it that I believe all the 800s do. And that's another common problem on these Polarises, is that sensor. Yep, now we're going to step this up to 50. We'll do 52 because I can't remember. Make sure they're started. There's a groove. There's a groove for those rockers to sit in. So make sure those are in the right spot. Make sure your cupped end is on your push rod side. We also need the dipstick. I leave that for last because the motor decides to lay down, beat up that dipstick pretty good. So, all right. Put our head cover here, replace that gasket. And we've got a gasket, exhaust gasket here, that gets replaced as well. Now this one is the dipstick bolt there. All right, this motor is pretty much done. We've got our starter left and dipstick, which I may not even put that dipstick in until we get it in the machine. These are little bolts, so be careful you don't torque these down too much and break them off. All right, this is for our starter here. Replace our oil filter and slide our starter in there. Make sure that these O-rings are good when you go to put that starter on there. You don't want water and debris. If that starter doesn't go on there right away, maybe pull it out, spin that gear a little bit, and try it again, because what's happening a lot of times is that gear's hitting that hitting on that starter drive gear. I'm gonna put a little bit of oil on there just so that slides in easier. It's got to go in there straight too, or it won't. There we go. And they need them both. All right, so that is rebuilding a Polaris Ranger 700, 800, and 900. And so if you've got questions, let me know. I'm going to change out this oil filter at this point, and I'm going to throw this motor in quick. Put the exhaust manifold on. Make sure you check that as exhaust manifold's really good. A lot of times they'll crack. We had to replace this one, so just keep an eye on there. You'll hear an exhaust leak if that's the case. So, all right, thanks for watching. If you've liked this video, please subscribe, like, and share this. If you have videos that you'd like me to make, let me know those. I work on stuff all the time. I've got different machines in here constantly, and tear down, rebuild, a lot of different motors. So, thanks for watching.